Hello, I am Rabbi Baruch Myers, and you're not. That's an old joke that was popular in one of the live comedy shows. But the topics in this week's parsha are anything but funny. It's a very rich, fascinating parsha called Teitzeh, which is characteristic by having really just tons of interesting laws. You know, the Parshiyot of the Torah, very often, some of them are more historical or telling a story. That's particularly true of the first book, Genesis, the stories of the forefathers and so on. Others have a lot of halachot, a lot of laws and mitzvot, a lot of commandments. The Parsha Teitzeh is in that second category. Just really a lot of commandments, and I wanted to touch on a few of them that are particularly interesting and or relevant. Relevant both in a Jewish context and in a universal context. Let me remind you, as we discuss different commandments, that the Torah has 613 commandments. Many depend on living in the land of Israel. Many of them don't. Some of those are only applicable in the time when the temple stood, for example, the offering of sacrifices. At the same time, many things which we look at as being a mitzvah are really more than one mitzvah. Shabbat is one example. A simpler example would be kashrut. Not eating milk and meat is one negative commandment. Eating animals that are kosher or not eating those that are not kosher, for example, a pig or a horse, is another commandment. Each of these is a separate commandment. Not eating blood is another commandment. So kosher is not actually one commandment. And again, let me remind you that the commandments are divided into three categories. Ultimately, they are fulfilled because they are God's will, as expressed in the Torah. That is the ultimate arbiter of them. Would they be merely based on human ration or a human tradition, there would be no absolute obligation to fulfill them. This is the fundamental logic of religion in general, or should be. And religious philosophies which do not base themselves upon an absolute divine revelation are not actually religious philosophies. They are human philosophies and therefore not based in the attempt to carry out God's will. Anyway, nonetheless, the commandments are divided into three kinds: those that are rational, not stealing, not killing; those that are testimony, the Shabbat or Pesach, which commemorates the Exodus from Egypt; and then there are the non-rational ones that don't have any specific reason. They are done in a very open way because we are commanded to do it in the Torah. Let's move straight to Teitzeh. It begins with a curious law, which I'd like to dwell upon, in spite of it being a little bit uncomfortable, but it has two very fascinating aspects. Teitzeh means when you go out. And it says when the Jewish people go out to war, and there's a whole host of things that come up in wartime, and they come up in wars fought by Israel, the people of Israel. I'm not referring now to the state of Israel, or the monarchy of Israel, for example, just like any other. And one issue, of course, is spoils. You know, you confiscate property. Armies do that. And another thing that was done was that captives were taken. And in some instances, it's not uncommon for people to find wives amongst the local population. And that is the beginning of our parsha. It says, when you see a Eshet Yefat Tohar. Eshet is a woman. Yefat Tohar means beautiful of appearance. Now, this would not be the recommended way, according to the Torah, of finding a partner. It's for a non-Jewish nation. Clearly, to marry her, she would have to enter the covenant of Judaism and keep all the commandments. Nonetheless, even so, this is clearly not the appropriate method. The Torah makes an interesting prescription and says that if you do want to take this Eshet Yifat Torah, this attractive woman from the nation that you conquered, as a wife, she has to live in your house for a month. You cannot have any kind of marital relationship with her. You have to wait till after a month, during which, however, her hair should be cut, nails should be cut, and she should not wear attractive clothing. After that time, if you decide to marry her, you may do so. Otherwise, you have to liberate her. You can't sell her. You can't. That's it. Just have to let her go. And the reason the Talmud explains, and it's cited in the commentary Rashi, that this is the case is because the Torah is actually taking into account the negative inclination of the person, and simply, instead of saying, you can't do this, it gives a methodology which allows you to try it, but in such a way that hopefully the person will overcome it. But there's a powerful psychological concept here, because generally speaking, decisions that are based on gut instinct, or decisions that are made on a compulsion of some kind, only are taken if one can do it right away. And I want to illustrate that. There's a very well-known doctor, Dr. Abraham Tursky, who's Orthodox, indeed a Hasidic Jew, a world-renowned expert on addictions. He had a patient who was addicted to drugs. He said, I'm going to let you continue to take drugs, but only one small condition. Every time you get a craving for a drug, you just have to wait a half an hour. You don't have to detoxify. This is my only condition. And the patient had to admit that this would have been worthless. The craving for drugs, and any craving which is unrational, needs to be fulfilled immediately. And that half hour may as well be a million years. It's undoable. In a relative sense, this is true of many decisions we make in life, that if they are reflexive and based on our lower instincts, it's not the kind of thing that we want rationally to put off. But the Torah here says waiting a month. The point is that kicks in consciousness and mindfulness. So the difference between needing to do something right away and saying, no, I'll wait till tomorrow to do it, is not one of quantity, but one of quality. One is gut instinct, even base instinct, and the very act of waiting, which is called in English delayed self-gratification, transforms it into something which the person will choose based on his sense and intellect rather than something he will be compelled to do. So it's a very interesting thing. But I want to now move to some of the laws, and I want to focus on three. One is a very vital theme that I speak about whenever possible. I must touch on it in this week's Parsha. It mentions about a man who was condemned to death. In certain cases, the Beit Din, after his execution, would hang the executed individual from a tree. The hanging is not a form of execution. He has already been killed in one of the other forms of execution prescribed by the Torah, which is practically a symbolic issue morally, because it was extremely rare for anyone to be executed, and this was due to the very strict criteria of testimony that was required in capital cases. And so, as many rabbis have pointed out, many Orthodox rabbis, that the embracing by the Torah of the death penalty is in no way an endorsement, or no way means that nowadays in the social spectrum that we fall on the side of those people who favor the death penalty, because the way it's implemented in modern society is entirely different than it's mentioned in the Torah. And for example, witnesses are questioned separately about even the very small details about how the accused was dressed and so on, and it's extremely difficult to the extent that it says that court that executed an individual once in 7 years, according to another version, once in 70 years, was considered a bloody court. It was extremely rare for people to be executed. And nonetheless, the idea of something being a capital crime did underline the moral gravity of it, and that is important. But indeed, it was not done happen. However, the Torah says that if it happens, in some cases, corpses hung, but not all night before sundown. Let's say the execution was in the morning. The body is hung from a tree. Before the evening must be taken down. And surely you shall bury. Kabor tikboreno is a double expression that he must be buried and in the same day. And all of the Talmud very naturally understands the oral tradition that this is not a special right of an executed individual. The executed individual becomes the example case of that which is true for every single Jewish person, all members of the covenant. When someone dies, he first of all must be buried. Kabor tikboreno. Second of all, it should be the same day. This is a very difficult challenge, very hard to carry out. The commandment of burial is fulfilled even if it's done on a different day. But what really must be said, especially in the context of Slovak Jewish culture, sadly, is if a body is cremated, then one has definitively not fulfilled the commandment of burial, and never can. It's too late, because the commandment to bury a person who has deceased devolves only upon the body of that person. Once you burn it, the dust and ashes no longer are subject to that commandment. It is no longer considered a body. To illustrate that, if a Kohen, you know that a Kohen may not come into contact with a corpse, a Kohen may not be in the same room as a corpse. This would contaminate him and is not befitting to his priestly status. But if there is, however, an urn, a cremation urn in a room, a Kohen is allowed to be there. That cremation urn, once that body has been disintegrated beyond recognition to small, tiny dust, it is no longer considered a body. And the finality of it is the most horrendous part of it, because if you can tell someone, you know what, bury it now, you can always, you want to, in 6 months, you think better of it, you want to cremate it. Once you cremate, that person cannot turn around in a month or 2 months and say, oh, I did the wrong thing, now I want to bury it. People think that. They take the urns, they bury it in the cemetery. It is a worthless act, because that act of burial can only be done when the person, the body is in its entirety. This is the respect and the dignity of the human body, which was the vessel of the commandments and all the good things that person did during his life. It contained the soul, and destroying it is an abomination in Judaism. And although we know that keeping Jewish religion is considered demanding, having a burial is not. I can tell you that, and it's really shocking in a way. I'm not trying to spice up this broadcast, but in the United States, people who eat on Yom Kippur and don't keep anything, but many of them, most of them, still acknowledge that being buried after they die is not going to really give them a tough day. And that's exactly what people do. If they can't live as a Jew, they die as a Jew. There should not be any justification made for cremations, and I mention it because the source of its prohibition is this week's Parsha, which is the only appropriate act for the person whose body has died, the soul becomes reunited with its maker, is to bury it in the ground. And whatever explanations, whether they're religious, it should not be looked at as a question of fundamentalism or being over strict. This is a beautiful attitude towards the physical body, one which expresses its dignity. And from any perspective, there's no reason to think that a cremation is more dignified than a burial. From the Jewish perspective, it's an absolute must. That's in this week's Parsha. And so that's very vital in a Jewish context. I'm going to skip chronologically to later in the Parsha, because I want to go to another issue which is also specifically Jewish, and it has to do with marriage and divorce. We have both of those also in this week's Parsha. That's a biggie. family status issues are in this week's Parsha. Strangely enough, the introduction of marriage is in the context of a divorce. A person has a wife, he doesn't want her, he sends her out, and then someone takes a new wife. It uses the expression ki yikach ish, when a man takes a wife, and hence the somewhat unilateral form of the marriage ceremony in which a ring nowadays, but halachically a object of value is given to the wife, upon which devolves the acquisition and the creation of the marriage relationship. And it is called ki yikach, when a man takes a wife. Yikach, the Talmud explains, requires giving something of value, because we find that yikach, the first time it's used in the Torah, by Abraham when he bought a grave for Sarah, it used that expression, kicha, the field of Ephron. And so they say, just like the field of Ephron, he said he's going to take it, and then he handed silver to the sons of Ephron. So too when it says kikach ish, when a man takes a wife, he should do so by giving something of value. Here I can't not make a small quasi-political idea that, by the way, that purchase of the cave of Machpelah was, of course, the city of Hebron. And already the Talmud points out there are only two places in the country of Israel that people cannot question our sovereignty over them throughout the ages, because, of course, even in ancient times, the sovereignty was questioned. The very first Rashi in the Torah, the God created the heavens and the earth. Rashi, the 11th century commentator, says it is written to establish who is in fact the master of the world. And so he says, when the non-Jewish nations will say, you stole the land of Israel, we'll be able to say, it is God who created the world and this land of Israel. He decided who to give it to take it from them, to give it to Jewish people, and so on. So this question is really has been relevant throughout the ages. The Talmud does say there are two places that, even for those who don't want to accept our sovereignty purely from a perspective of God's promise in the Torah, have to admit that Jerusalem and Hebron are categorically belongs to the Jewish people, because in the case of Hebron, we have Abraham paying for a purchase, and so to Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. Specifically, we find that King David actually did not rely on the divine promise and actually purchased it with money. And how ironic that the two places that are most brought into question in terms of Jewish sovereignty are both Jerusalem and Hebron. So that's a side point, but it is indirectly connected to this week's Parsha, where the purchase of Hebron in order to bury Sarah and later on the other patriarchs and matriarchs becomes the textual context upon which we understand that the word kicha means to buy. And so when a man marries a woman, he also has to give her something of value. Although it should be added, the Talmud derives two other forms of betrothal which are also binding according to the Torah. One is giving her a contract, even if that contract does not have any financial value. And the other one is trying to find the right word, copulation, basically the consummation of the relationship. In an instance where there was no other act of betrothal, it is assumed that when a man and woman cohabitate, that it is done with the intention that the man wants to betroth the woman for him to become his wife, except for instances where it's clear that this is not the case, prostitution, fornication, and so on. But generally speaking, if a man and a wife live together, and then they continue, they never had a chuppah, they never had kedusha, but they lived together for many, many years after that in a monogamous relationship, it is assumed that their cohabitation was done with the intention of becoming man and wife. The idea being that this would be enough to require that they need a divorce if they want to separate. And the divorce is a get. It is defined in the verses of this parsha. It is textually and throughout tradition specific criteria what a get must have. And without a get, the marriage is not dissolved. And that means without a get, the partners have other relationships, they are considered to be adulterous, those relationships. And what is worse is that if there is no get, and there are children from the adulterous relationship, they are in the category of mamzer. Let me explain that. That a woman who's eshet ish, who's been betrothed. I'll explain in a moment why I say a woman. If she does not divorced and she has relationships with another Jewish man, so that is this adulterous relationship, such that if they have a child, that child is called mamzer. And he cannot marry anyone, also this week's parsha. He cannot enter the congregation of Israel, meaning he can't marry another Jewish person. He's actually allowed to marry another mamzer or a convert, although that would still create a problem for his children. So this is a very undesirable result, although it should be added that the Torah is very specifically that only a certain case of mamzeru confers this problem, and hence we find that any doubts that are found, and indeed rabbis are encouraged to find doubts and reasons why the person may not be mamzer. But there are many ways a child can be a mamzer. If a brother and sister have relations and she becomes pregnant and has a child, it's also a prohibited relationship such that the child would be a mamzer. But the one that is most common and most treacherous is the case of divorces. This becomes the case when we have people who are Jewish not knowing about, perhaps, but not respecting the laws of religious divorce. They might get a chuppah because it's against. They think sadly, many people get divorced. They are not aware of the gravity and the importance of getting a religious divorce. That is made worse by religious movements that say they're not necessary. That can be a personal feeling. That can be some illusion of enlightenment and of modernity. But if someone's an atheist, I can't say boo to that person. If someone's trying to say that is Judaism, this is tragic because the Torah clearly requires a get. And so we have some religious movements. It is not my intention to polemicize, but it's a huge problem. So you have people, the average member of a Reformed temple in the United States will not, no pun there was meant, will not take the trouble of getting a religious divorce. If he then, if the woman specifically, men according to the Torah law strictly are allowed to have more than one wife. But if the woman finds another Jewish partner, they are both culpable of this adulterous relationship. If they have children, they get a civil marriage. Those children are mamzerim, and not to mention the gravity of the relation itself. So this is another law I want to focus on. This week's parsha, both the category of mamzer and as well as how it is brought about by the failure of gittin, the failure not to get the proper religious divorce, and how important that is. The Torah does not judge the mamzer at all. It's not, people say it's not his, of course it's not his fault, and just like a child born with a congenital disease, it's not his fault. This is a spiritual reality that is created through the parents' errors. The Talmud in Horayot says actually that mamzer becomes a scholar and a righteous person is greater than the high priest. So no moral judgment is being made here. But considerable limitations in terms of who that person can marry. So we've done burial, how important that is, as opposed to cremation, which is a terrible mistake. We've talked about people getting divorced in this week's parsha, how you get a proper get with a whole host of criteria that go along with that, and the tragic consequences when people don't do that. So something a little bit more spicy, I guess, something to move back in the parsha, something that is of huge relevance nowadays. We have a very interesting prohibition that says a woman should not wear the garment, should not dress or wear the garments of a man shouldn't dress like a woman. So in the parsha of Teitzeh, we have the prohibition of cross-dressing. Exactly how we figure out what's considered a man's way of dressing, what's considered a woman's way of dressing. Traditionally, that's not a huge problem. It is a fact that in most civilizations, there was distinct ways of dressing to represent the genders. And we have now a much more fundamental issue about how important is it for men and women to do things differently, how important is it to have gender distinction, and so on. But actually, this prohibition is not so much about, oh, I have to be manlike, I have to be, actually the Torah doesn't focus on that at all. The distinctions between men and women have more to do with what their responsibilities are. Indeed, it is Rashi quotes the Talmud in giving us what is really behind this prohibition. What is behind the prohibition is modesty. Talmud explains that a woman dresses as a man. It's much easier for it to, so to speak, infiltrate a group of men, and with the intention of inappropriate mingling, which will lead to immorality. So too the man who dresses up as a woman will more easily become part of a group of women, and the idea is he wants to do this in order to have inappropriate relationships with one of them. Now, if you follow this carefully, you'll see that the assumption is that men tend to be in groups of men, women tend to be in groups of women. This is also to some degree true. This is another whole topic unto itself, why the Torah generally recommends not too much intermingling between men and women, because it very often, whether we like it or not, does become a sexual experience. Attractions do occur in ways that we don't predict, and that, in fact, is human nature. So what we have behind the cross-dressing prohibition really is about not respecting some barriers between men and women. So it's not per se connected to the transgender issue, which is a much more complicated one, and beyond the parameters of this lecture. On a practical level, however, what is true is that what is considered feminine dress or male dress does change with societal factors. So once upon a time, only a man would wear trousers. A woman wearing trousers would put her in contradiction to the prohibition of cross-dressing. Now we have trousers that are meant for women. They're more feminine. We have the idea that women can wear any kind of trousers. And then many rabbis say that those women are not violating the prohibition of cross-dressing. That's it. A really fascinating parsha. I've only touched on the surface. So we've talked today about cross-dressing, about Jewish divorces, about burials, and we began at the beginning with the finding a wife in the nation that has been conquered in war. I want to end on this note because it comes back indirectly to the cross-dressing issue. Khatam Sofer makes a fascinating comment because part of the problem of taking a wife from a strange nation, a soldier, doing this, is also about the undue influence. Many other nations serve idols. Is this wife really going to give up her idolatrous ways? Cannot those idolatrous ways influence the husband? And the Khatam Sofer dwells on this point and says what we are learning is what is the fact that what we're not concerned about is hinted at in the name of the woman. She is called Eshet Yifat Toar. Toar means appearance. Yifat means beautiful of appearance. It's a construct or a genitive. And Eshet, Isha means a woman. It should say really Isha Yifat Tohar, a woman who is beautiful of appearance. Khatam Sofer asks, why does it say Eshet Yifat Tohar? He instantly translates, there's an allusion here. Eshet Yifat Tohar means a woman who is married to another beautiful woman. And so the Khatam Sofer introduces this topic of homosexuality into the beginning of the parsha in a very fascinating way. And he explains that in the parsha of Achrei, which we read on Yom Kippur, by the way, it says, you shall not do like the deeds of Egypt. Maimonides explains that this is a reference that he says Egypt, and that is in the parsha, of that parsha, in the context of prohibited sexual relations. So Maimonides says that the custom in Egypt was a man marries a man, a woman marries a woman. Same-sex marriages. Maimonides wrote this 800 years ago about Egypt in the time of the pyramids and the pharaohs. So this is not absolutely nothing new. It must be as old as mankind itself. And of course, there's genetic and hormonal factors as well. And by the way, and this will probably be another lecture, the Torah doesn't actually take a judgmental stand to the inclination of homosexuality. It prohibits the act of homosexuality. But at the same time, if that is prohibited, then a lifestyle which is built on that is also not considered correct according to the Torah. And so men marrying men, women marrying women would not be the kind of thing that we should do. And we have the answer, what would the Torah's viewpoint be? According to Maimonides, like the deeds of the Egyptians you shall not do, is specifically a prohibition of men marrying men and women marrying women. So we have in Maimonides already explaining the Sifri, which is a third century midrash. It says this already, saying that we are prohibited by this injunction not to have same-sex marriages. So the Torah is really as relevant as yesterday's news, even though we may not always right away from our modern societal, politically correct and very open-minded viewpoint understand why something should be problematic, because we go by the idea that they don't seem to be harmful to anybody. And of course, now, and on this note I will conclude, the laws of the Torah, unlike municipal laws, are not merely about not harming others, but they're about achieving holiness. And that can only be done not only by not harming others, but by elevating ourselves to a way of life as prescribed in the Torah, which makes us sanctified. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.